The topic today is, we are going to be talking about India's best and worst decades. Which decade do you think has done India proud, which has been the most productive, most fruitful? And also, at the side thing, as you know, we can also discuss the leaders at that time also, whether they took advantage of the opportunity or not. So Manish, which, according to you, has been the most productive decade until now?
Thank you very much, Priya, for inviting me to this session, Mr. Ram Madhav and the distinguished guests who are in this audience. So when you called me to speak on this particular subject, the first thought which crossed my mind was that this topic is like that question that when did you stop beating your wife? So
no, yes and no. But you can.
So therefore, it's one of those oxymorons which is increasingly difficult to calibrate for the simple reason that, first of all, I was wondering as to how do you calculate the decades? Do you calculate it from 47 to 57, 57 to 67, or do you calculate it from 1950 to 1960? How do you end up?
Manish being a lawyer.
How do you end up doing that calculation? But be that as it may, I think the founding decade of India, the decade between 1950 and 1960, was definitely the most productive decade in the short history of our republic, for the simple reason that between 1946 and 49, we wrote the founding document of India, a document which in its sheer diversity and genius really has no comparison even till today. On the 26th of January 1950, we adopted that constitution. And between 1950 and 1960, most of the seminal initiatives which were taken to transform an ancient civilization into a modern nation, the foundations of all those were laid. You know, whether if you look at the mega irrigation projects like Bhakra Nangal or the Hirakund Dam, or for that matter, the huge steel plants which were set up, Hindustan Machine Tools, and I can go on chapter and verse as to the various initiatives which were taken. And so undoubtedly, that decade laid the foundation. It became the building block on which we subsequently constructed our republic. And along the way, there have been successes, there have been failures, there have been sweet moments, there have been bitter moments. But if I was to reflect back with all objectivity, I think that was India's age of innocence. It was also India's age of really trying to come to terms with a world which was transforming very rapidly. And I think we ended up acquitting ourselves fairly well in that first decade.
Thank you, Manish. Now, Ram Madhav ji, here's a problem for you. This is also the decade of Jawaharlal Nehru, the decade that the BJP loves to hate. So which is your best decade? Most productive?
No, I agree with Manish ji that you cannot call any one decade the worst decade. It was not like that in the last 75 years of our history. We have seen ups and downs in our history. Manish ji was right. You know, first 10 years after we became independent and we became a republic, and we have had our own government under Prime Minister Nehru. Those were the initial years of the formation of the Indian state. So those years were relatively less controversial, no doubt about it. In terms of less productive decades, if you want to talk, one of the least productive decades was the 70s. After the 71 war, that great victory, somehow there was great downward slide in our country. We had seen the bad phase of emergency, a very unstable government followed by that for 3 years. So there was one decade which I would rate as less productive decade. But then otherwise, barring those unstable governments in between, you had one unstable arrangement between 89 and 91, then between 96 and 98. Rest of it, generally, those decades which were productive decades. Now, for me, I see the last decade as one of the best decades. Not saying that others are worst. But the last decade has been the best for India in the sense that what are the general parameters for any country to be called a developed country? They are generally speaking economy, technology, standard of living, infrastructure, and all these parameters what we have achieved in the last one decade. I would say under Prime Minister Modi especially, but generally in the last one decade, has been definitely phenomenal for India. In terms of productivity, I would say the last decade has been the best so far in the last 7 to 8 decades. No decade can be called worst. I mean, since the title says, best and worst decades, there was no worst decade. But yes, there were unproductive phases in our history, bad phases. I would say emergency was the worst phase in our history in the 75 years. The rest, of course, ups and downs have been there.
So Manish, looking back at the Congress years, which do you think, he's of course mentioned the last 10 years because of Prime Minister Modi, not the Vajpayee years, so I'm going to ask him that, but which has been the most decisive decade under a Congress Prime Minister?
Let me pick up from where Mr. Ram Madhav left off. And he made a very prescient point about 1971 and the spectacular victory which redrew the geopolitical map of South Asia after the partition of 1947. And that undoubtedly was India's finest moment and, of course, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's finest moment. One aspect which unfortunately never got documented and properly researched was that post the creation of Bangladesh, and the creation of Bangladesh in the teeth of opposition by President Nixon and his then National Security Advisor, later Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, actually also inaugurated a decade or inaugurated a couple of years where the intrusion of the Central Intelligence Agency, the ubiquitous foreign hand, into the internal affairs of India was actually at its peak. Ram Madhav is absolutely right. There is no defense for the emergency. And I have never held a defense for the emergency. But because of the emergency, the years which led up to the emergency from 1971 to 75 have not been objectively analyzed and critically appraised. And if someone was to go into the declassified archives of the US Department of State and other resources which are available, you would find, and I hope some historian or academic at some point in time would really apply himself to it, as to the extent of bitterness against India, the extent of withdrawal against India, the extent of interference against India, the overlooking of Pakistan's efforts to acquire a nuclear bomb, post the Multan Conference in 1972. So therefore, the 70s had a certain context. And I think that context we cannot really wish away when we analyze a particular period of our history. In terms of which has been the most productive decade, I'm sorry, I would not be in a position to really catalog it. And for the simple reason, because when I look at it, not each decade, each year in the past 75 years has had its highs, it has had its lows. If Mr. Ram Madhav says that in the past 10 years or 9 years, certain good things have happened, yes, certain good things have happened. I don't think anybody should take away from that. Between 2004 and 14, when the Indian economy grew at 7.8% year on year for 10 years, notwithstanding the great economic meltdown and the Eurozone crisis, I think that was a great decade for the Indian economy. So therefore, you really would be doing great injustice to history, if you start looking at decades in this binary.
Okay, so let's look at history. We've had that famous quote, let's make Manish happy, and talk about the Congress years where history will look kinder at certain Congress non-Gandhi prime ministers. Would you agree, of the Congress prime ministers, who is the most decisive? And by making Manish happy, I meant Congress prime ministers, not the other way around.
Probably I am not the right person to, probably comment on Congress prime ministers because you will only expect criticism from me. But as I said, first decade was the decade of the formation of Indian state. Whatever initiatives were taken by the then government, led by Prime Minister Nehru at that time, were never contested, never challenged at that point in time, except by some people, like Swatantra Party was challenging them, and a few others were challenging them. So Nehru tried to take the country in a particular direction. As a party and as a movement, we never agreed with the direction. For example, the socialist direction that he tried to take the country into, socialist pattern of society. While he went for big dams, he went for many other, big public sector enterprises. All those things he did lay the foundation for all those things. But the direction he sought to take the country into was the so-called socialist direction. We believed that it was a very wrong direction for the country to take at that point in time. It took 30 years to correct it. When another Congress Prime Minister came, namely Mr. Narasimha Rao, he decided that no, we have to now move to the other side and embrace globalization and etc. Very interestingly, when globalization was adopted, that time also we were critical of it. We said, no, in the name of globalization, you are, doing something, we should be Swadeshi-centric. So, what I'm trying to say is, each Prime Minister made his or her own contribution, no doubt. But in Nehru's account goes that great debacle of 1962. The debacle of 1962 made 1971 victory much more sweet. It was sweeter for us because we had a bad defeat 10 years back. Definitely, it was a landmark achievement for us. In fact, we all know that Mr. Vajpayee, standing in the parliament, openly praised Indira Gandhi. Whether he used that phrase Durga and all is contestable, but he did support the government's actions, did stand by the government at that time. So there were phases like that.
But Manish, we talked about 62 and emergency. I think those are the two issues that will keep coming up to haunt you. But he also said that Nehru took India to the socialist turn, which they're not happy with. But isn't Prime Minister Modi kind of doing the same? He talks about capitalism, but this whole welfare, Revdi economics, even the BJP is doing the same.
See, again, there's a context to the founding decade of India. And the context is that in 1945, the world came out of a devastating world war, which completely and absolutely had destroyed nations across the globe. You had the atomic bomb being used for the first time. You had a Holocaust which was carried out in the name of race. And immediately after that, you had the world divided into two blocks. The famous speech of Winston Churchill at Fulton Falls that an iron curtain has descended across Europe. And it was in that context that you had to make choices. And the choice which Prime Minister Nehru made at that point in time was that India should actually try and adapt or adopt the model of democratic socialism as opposed to scientific socialism, which was the Soviet model. And again in 1991, when Congress Prime Minister, Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, had to course correct. That course correction also happened in the context that the Berlin Wall came down, the whole of Soviet Union and East Europe collapsed. There had to be a reset, and the Washington consensus, the neoliberal economic order was the flavor of the day. You had to align yourself. So what I'm saying is that no particular action of any government or any prime minister can really be divorced from the context in which those actions have been taken. Again, you talked about Prime Minister Modi. Right? Prime Minister Modi, increasingly, with great respect to him, actually sounds like Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. When he talks about Atmanirbhar Bharat, it is self-reliance. When he talks about the global south, it is the non-aligned movement. So increasingly, when I hear Prime Minister Modi, and as someone who's kind of been interested in public life for a very long time, I see not shades, but almost a complete mirroring of what Prime Minister Indira Gandhi used to say at that point in time. And again, I think he's also reacting to a certain context. You know, again, after the great economic meltdown, you know, the rise of the forces against globalization, the Washington consensus broke down, and therefore you had to find your way in that multipolar world. Mr. Ram Madhav is itching to respond, so I will hold my horses.
No.
But
Congress has a very peculiar habit of taking credit for every good thing, including leaders. If Prime Minister Modi is seen very successful today, no, he is like Indira Gandhi. In fact, Manish ji said he is like Indira Gandhi. Somebody told me yesterday that he is like Nehru. Of all. That shows the. If he is following Indira Gandhi's policies today, why was there a no confidence motion by so-called India? No, we have our clear-cut policies. We have our clear-cut vision. Because he is successful today, everybody wants to, associate with success. The point is, since you talked about Madam Indira Gandhi, yes, she had certain things to her credit initially. You talked about socialism as a kind of a situation in 1950s. There was no compulsion for bank nationalization in late 60s. There was no such compulsion at that time. So, decisions were taken at that time, thinking probably you are right, in a given context, given policy inclinations or ideological inclinations, not necessarily that they were right decisions. They caused a lot of harm to the country. I talked about 70s, this bogey of CIA. Indira Gandhi used to invoke all the time. I'm doing all these things because CIA is after me. No. There was no justification. Also, of course, I do appreciate that Manish agreed that, he cannot justify emergency. Nobody can justify. I mean, it was unjustifiable. So, basically, we are in two different ideological realms. We represent different views. What Prime Minister Modi is doing today is what we stood for all these years, all these decades.
Well,
may I just make the final point, because your producer is asking us to wrap up? No, I was only on the question of what Ram Madhav ji referred to as the abolition of privy purses and the nationalization of banks. And I completely agree that certain decisions are ideological. And political parties make decisions for ideological reasons. Just as the abrogation of 370 and the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir, which is an ideological decision. So therefore, at certain points of time in the evolution of our republic, people who are in charge make decisions for reasons of ideology or, very, very deeply held beliefs. Then it is for history to judge whether those decisions are right or wrong.
Or for expediency, don't forget that. But thank you so much, Ram Madhav and Manish Tewari. You kept the hall full even after Nawazuddin Siddiqui. So I have two political rock stars with me. Thank you so much.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.